Recording in progress.
Hi everyone, we are back with another episode of Mellow Musings. What is Mellow Musings? I must tell you about Mellow first. Somrita, please kick off people better.
Yeah, sure.
Mellow, the Society for the Study of the Multi-Ethnic Literatures of the World, is a society that was formed in the year 1997. Some of my colleagues and I together put this society, and since then we have come a long way. We have been organizing a lot of literary events, conferences. We bring out a journal. We invite people for our conferences to give special talks. We have special prizes for young scholars and so on. And recently we have started Mellow Musings. These are fortnightly, and of course they could be more often than fortnightly online discussions on literature mainly, but other subjects also that we are interested in. So this is another episode of Mellow Musings, and I am Manju Jetka. I am the chief functionary of Mellow. And we all are a very big group, and we are adding to our numbers regularly. In today's session, we have a very interesting topic. You'll just get to know about it in a little while. And the speaker is Abin Chakraborty. Abin Chakraborty will be in conversation with Somrita Misra. They're both here on the screen. Now, I am going to hand over the proceedings to the two of them, Abin and Somrita, and I'll switch off my video, and I request everyone to keep themselves muted and their videos switched off. But later on, when we want to have a discussion or when we wish to take part in the conversation, then we can always switch on our videos and unmute ourselves. So here is another session, and we're going to be talking about Franz Fanon. Over to you, Somrita and Abin. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am. So without further ado, let me begin. Am I audible?
Yes.
My audio is clear? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Abinda, and thank you, ma'am. Right. This is episode 8 of Mellow Musings, as Manju ma'am has already introduced for the audience. And today we are joined by Dr. Abin Chakraborty, who will be our speaker. The topic for today is Fanon and the Anatomy of Postcolonial Maladies. Dr. Abin Chakraborty is Assistant Professor in English at Government General Degree College, Shalboni, West Bengal. His papers have been published in several national and international journals, He is also the editor of the international online journal Postcolonial Interventions, and very recently, his co edited anthology, Postcolonial Popular Culture in India, was published by Orient Black Swan, which is available on Amazon and many other platforms if you all are interested. We look forward to a great conversation ahead, and I will now invite Professor Chakraborty, Dr. Chakraborty, to please start his talk. Abinda, over to you.
Thank you, Somrita, for the kind introduction. Uh, Good evening to one and all who are participating in this eighth episode of Mellow Musings. Let me begin by first expressing my gratitude towards Professor Manju Jaidka for inviting me to deliver this talk on Franz Fanon. As you can see, the title of my paper or talk is Fanon and the Anatomy of Postcolonial Maladies. The thing is that as far as Franz Fanon is concerned, he is obviously one of the most important post-colonial thinkers of the 20th and also the 21st century. He was born in 1925 in the French colony of Martinique. From there on, he became a soldier for the Allied Army during the Second World War. Then he went back to Martinique and worked with Aimé Césaire. Afterwards, he came back to France in order to study medicine. And based on his professional training, he then went on to work in Algeria in a psychiatric clinic. And it was here that Fanon actually became involved in the Algerian struggle for independence against French colonization. And such was the extent of his involvement that he was eventually expelled from Algiers and he joined the Algerian National Liberation Front for the independence of Algeria from French domination. And much of the literary or critical output that is associated with Fanon is based on his own experience as a francophone black person who is subjected to various forms of colonial racism, and B, his role as an active participant in that struggle for independence which took place in Algeria. While he was there as a doctor, he became familiar firsthand with the kind of inhuman physical and psychological torture that the French authorities inflicted on the people of Algeria. And that led to a great deal of disillusionment as well. And he was also aware of the fact that such dehumanization, such barbaric torture, not only left a permanent scar on the minds of many of the people who were subjected to such tortures, but even the torturers had to cope with different kinds of nightmares and struggles of their own. And all of these experiences, the abiding racism that he faced in France as a black francophone person, the colonial atrocities which he witnessed firsthand in Algeria, and his experience of joining the struggle for independence and becoming part of the everyday decolonial process that was unfolding in Algeria, all of that can be found reflected in the significant works which he has left behind for posterity before dying quite young in only 1961. He wasn't even 40 years old when he died, but owing to a combination of leukemia and pneumonia, he died in 1961. The texts which he has left behind, Black Skin and White Masks, A Dying Colonialism, The Wretched of the Earth, Toward the African Revolution, have all been extremely significant in shaping post colonial consciousness and struggle across the world, whether it is in Africa or in Latin America or among the African American people in the United States or in other parts of Asia. Fanon has always been an extremely influential thinker. For the sake of today's lecture, I will primarily focus on The Wretched of the Earth, translated by Constance Farrington in 1963, with a preface by Jean Paul Sartre. The reason why I choose this particular text is because of the fact that it is a pioneering text whose insights continue to resonate in today's contemporary world beyond the confines of either the African experience or the experiences of Black people as a whole. And even more particularly, we shall focus on the chapter called Pitfalls of National Consciousness, which prophetically outlines various challenges faced by post colonial nation states from the resolute Marxist perspective, which Fanon had sustained till the end of his life. If one looks at the challenges that Fanon is talking about, we see that his primary concern is the fact that the idea of nationalism, which plays such an important and significant role in ensuring decolonization, in ensuring the post-colonial independence of different subjugated people, is not something that can sustain the evolution nation state in the long run. Which is why he says that nationalism, that magnificent song that made people rise against their oppressors, stops short, falters, and dies away on the day that independence is proclaimed. And he is emphasizing the fact that if a nation, newly independent or otherwise, is to progress, then there has to be a shift from national consciousness to political and social consciousness. And that is again very significant. Whether we are talking about post colonial nation states in Africa, whether we are talking about nation states in Latin America, or whether we are talking about various nation states in Asia, including India, this shift from national consciousness to political and social consciousness is of vital importance. Once he starts talking about the nation states, he talks about the fact that there are different kinds of fissures that begin to creep up within the structure of the nation state quite regularly from the very moment of inception. And again, if one looks at the history of India, we would see that our independence coincided with the partition of the nation and the harrowing consequences of that partition. And was it really something that the people wanted? Was it really something that communities across the subcontinent actually wanted? Probably not. In most cases, we see that that kind of migration and carnage associated with the partition left a very deep and irreversible trauma in the minds of the people, something which they could never really anticipate or something that they could never really understand. And it was the statesmen, the politicians, who, because of their own particular vested interests, failed to keep the subcontinent united. And as far as Fanon is concerned, most of the post colonial nation states who acquire independence under the leadership of what he calls the national middle class or the comprador bourgeoisie, they are incapable of actually ensuring national upliftment and national unity. And that is why there are so many different crises that post colonial nation states regularly suffer from. And the partition of India could well be seen as one such example. And of course, when we are talking about India, it's not just the partition. It's partition. It's there are different kinds of agricultural problems. There is a great deal of social inequality. There are issues related to caste and gender, and all of these problems would keep on exploding in the form of different kinds of events during the course of the subsequent decades. We would see the Naxalite movements, the movement of the Dalit Panthers. We would see various kinds of regional conflicts over language and ethnicity and so on and so forth. And many of these problems are still going on. And these are precisely the cracks in the edifice that Fanon had focused on. And one has to remember that we are talking about a text which was written in 1961 and translated in 1963. But unfortunately, or more than 60 years down the line, many of these prophecies, many of these warnings, caveats that Fanon had issued are still as relevant as they were during the time of their conception. As far as this national bourgeoisie is concerned, or this comprador bourgeoisie is concerned, Fanon is extremely critical of them. Fanon is very harsh in his assessment of the capacities and the tendencies of this particular class. And as far as he is concerned, for the national bourgeoisie, decolonization or nationalization or independence simply means the transfer into native hands of those unfair advantages which are a legacy of the colonial period. And he goes on to add that as far as the bourgeoisie is concerned, they are only a kind of a transmission line between the nation and capitalism, rampant though camouflaged, which is also supplemented by the specters of neo-colonialism. The point is, why is Fanon being so harsh? Obviously, Fanon was writing on the basis of his own African experience, and Fanon could see how different kinds of national governments, whether in Senegal or in Mali or in Democratic Republic of Congo or elsewhere, how all of these countries were begging the former colonial masters for different kinds of assistances, financial assistances, and how the natural resources of those countries were being allowed to be purchased by different kinds of multinational corporations settled in those former colonial master countries, in those metropolitan centers, whether in London or Paris or in different parts of the USA. And this is precisely why Fanon is so aghast. Fanon is so critical of this particular class because, as far as he is concerned, this class, instead of being able to contribute towards national development, is only continuing with the kind of inequality that was there in the colonial period, except now instead of the white sahibs, you have brown and black sahibs. This is the only difference as far as Fanon is concerned, and that is precisely why he is so scathing in his attack. And the thing is that if one looks at the way in which different kinds of nation states have functioned, be it the various banana republics in Latin America, or be it various countries in the African continent, or even across Asia, one will see that the influence of these former colonial masters through different kinds of international treaties and the interference of international bodies like the World Bank or the IMF and so on and so forth often led to the shrinking of sovereign control and the domination of these particular countries' politics and economics those uh, by those forces of the neocolonial financial structures which have acquired a kind of a global dimension, which have created a new form of the empire, no longer that old territorial version, but something entirely different. And it is this colonial specter that constantly leads to the kind of rage and wrath that one witnesses in the various different proclamations that are issued by Fanon during the course of his assessment. If one looks at the case of India itself, despite the fact that a great deal has been done with regard to poverty alleviation, according to the data of different kinds of groups that have published their surveys, 234 million people in India still continue to experience extreme poverty. And India, in fact, is one of the top five countries with the largest number of people living in poverty, alongside Pakistan, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. All of these are, of course, former colonies. So the question is, why are these particular former colonies suffering from such extensive poverty, and why have these particular problems not been alleviated? And the answer that Fanon would offer is that it is because these countries have been led by various groups emerging out of the class of the national bourgeoisie that certain kinds of policies have been introduced which have led to the continuation of poverty, which have led to the continuation of inequality in different ways. Of course, as far as we are concerned, and as far as Fano himself is concerned, the problem is not limited to merely inequality and monopolizing of resources by a very small, minuscule minority. There are other problems as well. And one of the problems that Fano repeatedly talks about is the idea of chauvinism. And Fano says that instead of talking about African unity, the people continuously slide back into chauvinism in its most bitter and detestable form. Chauvinism, in its most bitter and detestable form, is also very much a part of the post-colonial reality of various other nation states, such as India. Which is why, despite the fact that we are in 2025, we are still, for whatever reason, debating about someone like Aurangzeb, who has died so many centuries earlier. Again, Fano also continues to argue that despite the fact that so many people were, so moved by the idea of African unity, Pan Africanism, and so on and so forth, immediately after independence, one witnesses that there is a great deal of regionalism that raises its head, and the idea of either national unity or continental unity disappears as well. And again, if one looks at the context of the subcontinent, one witnesses similar kinds of regionalism, similar kinds of chauvinism, similar kinds of otherization at work in different ways. So within India, if one takes, for example, the issue of Northeast India, have we been able to successfully integrate the rest of India with the concerns of Northeast India? Obviously, we have not. The fact that a state like Manipur has been burning with so much detestable violence for such a long period of time without there being any kind of visible national outrage is indicative of the fact that our national imaginary is often very parochial and is not really able to include within its confines all those who share the identity of being Indian. And again, if one looks at the history of the kind of violence that has been subjected to people coming from the northeast states, whether in a city like Delhi or in Bengaluru or in different campuses of different colleges and universities across the country, one would see that this kind of chauvinism is something that has been threatening our body polity as well. And again, it's not just a case of India. You go to Sri Lanka and you see the kind of otherization that has been inflicted on the Tamils. You go to Myanmar and you witness the kind of horrible atrocities which have been inflicted on the Rohingyas. You go to Pakistan and you look at the situation in Balochistan and the kind of crisis that is constantly brewing there. So these kinds of regional fissures, and of course, we would not mention the most violent and catastrophic sagas of them all, and that is the saga of Kashmir. But wherever you look, these particular kinds of fissures and these kinds of regional threats are always to the fore. And the reason why it is so, according to Fanon, is because of the fact that the national bourgeoisie only understands the idea that we have to enjoy all those powers and privileges which the colonial masters once did. So, by that simple logic of replacement and substitution, they acquire power. But once that power is acquired, what is to be done with it? That again is something that causes a great deal of problem. And just as the elite are only busy bothering about how to replace the white sahibs, in the same way, we see that across different regions, there are different kinds of xenophobic interests that are stoked by different political parties, different kinds of ethnic groups for vested interests of their own, as a result of which such regionalism, such forces of otherization often take the upper hand. And of course, the problem lies also with the state, which instead of being able to help people, which instead of being able to devote itself to the welfare of the people, often turns into a kind of monstrosity that either does its best to subjugate the population as long and as far as possible, or unleashes different kinds of atrocities, or becomes so mired in various forms of corruption and profiteering and so on and so forth that it finds itself incapable of rising to the demands of the people. As Fanon says, that this post-colonial state often makes a spectacular display and jostles people and bullies them, thus intimating to the citizen that he is in continual danger. There are two kinds of dangers which the post-colonial state generally fosters. One, there are different kinds of external threats, and two, there are different kinds of internal threats, and both of these threats have to be fought, and there is always a kind of a belligerent rhetoric uh, that is being disseminated by the state in order to keep people always in that mode of fear and fight. And again, this is something that we obviously witness enough in India. Either there are, external terrorists or Pakistan, or there is George Soros, or there is China, or there is somebody else, right? And even within India, we see that the powers that be often identify certain sections of the population as internal enemies, and they are given different kinds of name, either urban Naxals or Tukre Tukre gang, or simply, people who are traitors and treasoners. And you even see the imposition of colonial era laws in order to silence and imprison those who are criticizing the government, who are criticizing the status quo in one way or another. And in order to allay the fears or the anxieties of the citizen, there are always different spectacles. Just as there were those gladiatorial games in Rome, there are always a large number of fairs and festivals and other kinds of spectacular events which are always being organized. So whether it is the inauguration of a new parliament building, whether it is the establishment of some gigantic statue or temple. There are so many different kinds of prestige expenses, as Fano says, which are constantly performed by the bourgeoisie in order to make sure that the public re- remains unaware of the actual issues of bread, land, and fruit. And this is what Fano also says. Far from embodying in concrete form the needs of the people in what touches, sorry, far from embodying the needs of the people in what touches bread, land, and the restoration of country to the sacred hands of the people, the leader will reveal his inner purpose, which is to become the general president of that company of profiteers impatient for their returns, which constitutes the national bourgeoisie. And again, think of all the different heads of state that you are familiar with across the continent of Asia or in other parts of the world as well, and the kind of bonhomie that they share with the billionaires and the millionaires of their countries, and the various different kinds of steps that are taken to waive off their loans, to give them clearances, to reduce their fines, and to make sure, of course, that they don't really have to pay the taxes that are owed to them. And whether it is in the Americas or whether it is in Africa or Asia, this kind of nexus between the bourgeoisie and the government is something that is often on full display. And of course, we in India are also quite familiar with such spectacles. But none of this actually changes the situation on the ground. On the ground, the problems, the specters, the crises associated with the standards of living, lack of resources, and so on, they keep enhancing, they keep uh, exploding in different ways, which is why Fano says that the peasant who goes on scratching out a living from the soil and the unemployed man who never finds employment do not manage, in spite of public holidays and flags, new and brightly colored though they may be, to convince themselves that anything has really changed in their lives. I am reminded in this context of a particular Bengali poem by Rafiq Azad, which was written in 1974 in the context of the Bangladesh famine. And in that particular poem, Azad has a line which reads, "Bhat de haramjada noile manchitro khabo," which translates as, "Give me food, bastard, or I will engulf your map." And again, this is precisely the kind of crisis that Fano is also talking about. It doesn't matter what the displays of power are, it doesn't matter how pompous the various buildings are or how bright the decorations are. Across the country, the subordinated masses, the disenfranchised masses continue to suffer in different ways, which is why they lose interest in the nation. And the moment they lose interest in the nation, they also fail to participate in the regular functioning of the nation. And the moment they stop participating in the regular functioning of the nation, it obviously becomes easier to simply use them as pawns, to simply bribe them into appearing for different kinds of rallies, or enticing them with food and drink and various other kinds of offerings, so that they will vote for one party or another. But that is only a certain kind of tokenism. It is merely a way to use the masses as pawns instead of actually providing them with agency and the possibility of upliftment. And again, if this is something that we can see in India, where the global hunger index shows that our score is 27.3, and we rank 105th out of 127 countries with sufficient data for such a hunger index calculation. And there are these issues of undernourishment, child stunting, child wasting, and child mortality, which remain key issues in India even after 75 years of independence. So while it is possible for some to simply, enjoy the rhetoric of Amrit Kal and so on and so forth, the facts on the ground, the reality on the ground is very different from whatever ideal uh, vision or fantasy one seeks to project. And again, why is that? And Fanon's answer would be, it is because the national bourgeoisie which is in charge, it is because the national bourgeoisie which is running the country is incapable of actually delivering inclusive welfare. And of course, as a part of this inefficiency, there is a great deal of corruption that multiplies. And again, we in India have been witnesses to hundreds and hundreds of scams over decades, and nothing really changes on the ground. Some people get some jail time here and there, but other than that, everything more or less remain the same, and the people continue to perpetrate various kinds of fraud on various levels. In India, you have, for example, seen the scam of the electoral bond, which some have identified as the biggest scam that India has seen since its independence. There are other scams as well associated with employment in schools and colleges. There are scams related to the distribution of food items through the public distribution system. There are scams associated with the building of dams and houses and railway lines and bridges and so on and so forth. There are scams across the country, across the borders of the state, and they are obviously too numerous and too voracious to actually list. Why? Why is that the case? It is the case because, again, you have those people in power who are actually not interested in ensuring proper redistribution of wealth so that there is collective upliftment possible. And secondly, the political parties that are associated with these classes, they also operate as a kind of machine that, instead of allowing the people to rise, only keeps them, as Fano says, hemmed in and immobilized. And the party helps the government to hold the people down. The party, and by the party, I don't mean any one party, I'm talking about political parties in general. These political parties, instead of listening to the masses and trying to help them in whichever way possible, mostly only focus on how to keep themselves in power, and keeping themselves in power obviously means nullifying resistance, and nullifying resistance also means ignoring the actual sources of discontent. And that is exactly what goes on in various post-colonial nation states, including India. And again, you can look at other neighboring countries like Bangladesh and Pakistan as well. These issues of corruption are rampant in those countries as well. And there again, we have seen the political parties and their leaders being involved in different kinds of scams of various different proportions. And we see that people associated with these political classes often continue to live in brazen luxury while the rest of the country continues to suffer through different kinds of abject deprivations. And of course, when such deprivation becomes very serious and the people begin to express their discontent more urgently, we see that the army and the police are brought in as the pillars of the state, which helps the status quo to continue. This is exactly what Althusser would later identify as the repressive state apparatuses. Now, again, if you look at the way in which deforestation was being carried out in Hyderabad very recently, and how the protesters there were treated by the police, you will get an idea of what actually goes on in the name of law enforcement. Again, there are so many other instances of dissent being crushed through violation of human rights, whether in Kashmir or in Manipur or elsewhere. Recently in Bangladesh, we saw how last year a public uprising led to the loss of so many lives because of the kind of violence which the state inflicted on it in order to protect itself. And all of these problems were perceived by Fanon way back in the 1960s. What then is the solution? And this is where the idea of political education comes in. And as far as political education is concerned, uh, we have to understand that political education is not something that works from a top down model, on the basis of a top down model. It doesn't really work like that. Spivak would later on talk about unlearning one's privileges in order to learn from the subaltern. Fanon was indicating something similar. He was talking about the fact that the government cannot treat the masses in a paternalistic manner. It cannot infantilize them. It cannot defraud them by using technical jargons of one kind or another. Nor should the party simply act as the understudy to the administration and help to restrict the masses in different ways. Instead, it should obviously try and make sure that they can be inspired. It should try and make sure that they can be enlightened. But instead of such prospects, what we are generally left with are various patterns of obedience and discipline, which both the party and the administration seek to enforce on the people. And talking about the role of the people, he says that we often believe with criminal superficiality that to educate the masses politically is to deliver a long political harangue from time to time. And again, this is what happens across the post-colonial world. There are speeches by leaders, but do they listen? The leaders keep talking to us enough times, but do they listen? Is there any way in which we can see the leaders participating in a kind of a question answer session with people from different parts of either his constituency or his country or things of that sort. We don't really see that. Allowing them and awakening them and allowing the birth of their intelligence. Political education means the birth of political intelligence among the masses. But again, as far as post-colonial countries are concerned, leaders are more concerned with keeping people down, simply using them as pawns and not to listen to their opinions. In fact, if the birth of such intelligence takes place, if, as Amy Cesar said, souls are indeed invented, then there will be questions. And as we know, nobody likes listening to questions. Across India, people don't like really listening to questions or answering them, which is why even a joke can be substantial enough for you to end up behind bars. And we have seen the kind of democratic backsliding that has been going on in India for the last few years or so, in accordance with the data that is released by different kinds of international organizations. But again, the same thing would be seen in Bangladesh previously as well. We would see similar things in Pakistan. We would see similar things in other parts of Africa as well. So it's not just our own unique problem, but a post-colonial problem confronting a large part of the world. And Fanon insists that people can't keep expecting one single messiah to arrive and do everything for them. They have to take on the role and the responsibility themselves. And it is through them, it is through the people that any kind of possible change might emerge. And for this, he says the battle line against hunger, against ignorance, against poverty, against unawareness ought to be ever present in the muscles and intelligences of men and women. If you are constantly bothered about mandirs and masjids, if you are constantly bothered about an emperor who died hundreds of years ago, if you are bothered about caste and so on and so forth, how will you fight unitedly against hunger, against ignorance, against poverty? And Fanon knew in the context of Africa, where various kinds of tribal identities are often extremely hostile and volatile, he knew how these particular battle lines against hunger, ignorance, poverty, etc., are often obfuscated. And that is precisely what he had warned the other countries about so that they don't fall into the same trap. And again, at the core of all of this, he believed there must be a doctrine concerning the division of wealth and social relations. This issue of class is something that we often forget when we are fighting over identities, when we are fighting over cultural values, when we are fighting over different kinds of abstract stories about who we are and what we must become. Fanon puts that question straight at the center so that we don't shy away from it, so that our minds can never be turned away from it, so that we can ensure collective development in a sense which has not yet been possible in most post-colonial states around the world. This is why Fanon is so significant. And I've given this Indian example, and this is from the Oxfam study. So, and you can see from this study the kind of crisis that I am talking about, the kind of inequality that there exists, the kind of deprivation that there exists, and how nothing really is being done to close this gap. Instead, we see that it is the rich who keep getting richer and the poor keep getting poorer. This is why the idea of nationalism is never really enough. And there has to be a rapid transformation of that national consciousness into social and political needs. That is what Fanon keeps insisting on. And he says that it is important that a national government ought first to give back their dignity to all citizens. People dying of hunger, people dying because of lack of basic medical facilities, people dying on account of caste or creed related violence do not have any dignity. It is the responsibility of the state to ensure that dignity. The state cannot ensure that dignity if it uses a bulldozer to crush people's houses. But that is precisely the kind of dignity which it needs to offer to the people, and therein lies the significance of Fanon for contemporary times. And that is all that I have to say about Fanon for the time being. And I hope that we can now extend the conversation a bit further on the basis of questions and answers. So I'll leave the floor to Somrita.
Thank you, Avinda. And that was a very insightful lecture. We have all studied Wretched of the Earth, I think, at some point of time in the post colonial discourse. But the explanations and the examples given today, I'm sure, will help us have new insights into it. So let us start with the idea of violence. What do you think about Fanon's idea of violence in today's context? How do you see it?
Yeah, the first chapter of The Wretched of the Earth is, of course, on violence. And Fanu was talking about the fact that colonialism is violence in its natural state. Now, if one looks at the way in which Israel has been continuing its undeterred aggression in Palestine, and if we look at the number of people, children, men, and women who have been massacred over the last few months, we see that the diagnosis of identifying colonialism as violence in its natural state is very much true even now. The question is, how does one resist it? As one of the other questions in the chat box has also mentioned, to what extent is that kind of a prospect of violent resistance acceptable today? As an individual who is not in favor of violence, who does not practice violence, I obviously can't uh, I accept the idea of resisting through violence. But one of the problems that one faces is that if all the non-violent modes of expressing dissent are asphyxiated, what is one left with? What does one do when all the institutionalized non-violent modes of challenge and resistance are taken away from you? What do you do? We can't really say what one does because fortunately we have not been in those positions. But there are people across the country and in different parts of the world who have been subjected to experiences that are unimaginable for us. How they will react, what sort of scars they have on their psyches because of the violence that they have been subjected to, and what that will make them do is not something that any lay academic can at all answer. This is something that sort of emerges out of the direct heat of the experience, and we can't really assume that we know enough to uh, answer these questions from an absolutely neutral and distant and objective perspective. So that problem is obviously there. But again, the other problem which one also has to acknowledge is that even in the post colonial nation states, one keeps witnessing various different forms of systemic violence. And some of those instances of systemic violence keep on repeating the same kind of apparatuses and the same kinds of modalities which were once used by the colonial powers. So, in that sense, we haven't really become post colonial, have we? And that is again a question which the state has to face and answer. in how it can actually go beyond the post-colonial, how it can go beyond the colonial past instead of simply repeating.
One idea that we glean from Fanon's analysis is urgent reform in the present. So, what do you think that reform should be in today's world?
One of the things that Fanon insisted on was extreme decentralization. He was always talking about the participation of the people in the process of governance, even if it takes long, even if there are problems in the way. So that kind of extreme decentralization could well be a kind of a starting point. We don't really have that kind of decentralization in India even now, and we don't have that decentralization in various other parts of the world as well, where again the systems are far too stratified, far too hierarchical. So if there is any one thing that one can sort of take away from Fano and start implementing at the ground level, then that idea of decentralization would obviously be essential.
So, breakage of the colonial hierarchy,
Right.
dismantling of that,
Right.
right? Fanon also spoke at length about culture. Which of his ideas regarding culture would you consider relevant today?
Right. And this also would be sort of tied up with Professor Manju Jadka's question on nationalist discourse in today's world of globalization. Fano was obviously deeply interested in national culture in the sense that he was aware of the kind of erasure, vilification, and destruction that was faced by national cultures at the hands of the colonial powers, especially in Africa, where again many of the tribes had orature and not literature. So, language and other kinds of cultural elements were subjected to a great deal of threat from the colonial powers. And Fano obviously insisted that a process of national regeneration must include a revival and a successful fostering of the cultural resources, the indigenous cultural resources of one's own. Having said that, he also added that we should not consider culture as a fossil. It should not be seen as something that is ossified in the past. Culture and identity are not things which we can excavate from some deep caves hundreds and hundreds of years ago and use it afresh without any modification in the present. It doesn't work like that. The past needs to be respected, but the past needs to be supplemented with considerations of the present, which is why Fano talked about how the folk performers in Africa often modified their content during the nationalist struggles to suit anti colonial themes. And again, this is something which had happened in case of India as well. If one looks at the Bengali jatras, for example, we will see that before and after independence, political jatras were extremely popular across the countryside, where different kinds of international figures also made their presence felt. International figures, referring to international political figures, international figures of history, in order to rouse the people, in order to mobilize the people, in order to ensure that they participated in the political process of their own emancipation. And that was Fano's vision of culture, something that respected the past, something that freely, liberally borrowed from international resources, and something that was obviously in tune with the fighting needs of the people in the present.
So, well, we can well see how that is very relevant today because either it's culture uniformity, the one culture that everyone wants, or it's a complete surrendering to the globalization mania of previous colonial powers. So, yes, Fanon's ideas would be deeply relevant today. I would just ask one last question and then we will open this up for the audience if anybody has any questions which they want to ask you, which is that Fanon spoke about the psychological scars of violence. Are those of contemporary relevance today to us?
Yes, they are, and this is where the uh, role of the academic becomes constrained in the sense that we, because of the kind of privileged positions that we occupy, are not always in the line of fire, and therefore the kind of violence, the kind of systemic violence that people face, and the consequences of such violence on them is not something that we can really estimate. I remember reading those short stories by the Kashmiri Pandits, and I recall their experiences of living in the tents, the bite of mosquitoes and scorpions, the absolutely disgusting sanitary conditions which they had been exposed to, and of course the trauma of losing their loved ones, seeing their houses aflame, and so on and so forth. Now, unless one experiences that, how does one talk about what sort of scars such events leave on the mind of the individual in question? Do we really have the authority to know that sufficiently? Can we really talk about the consequences of such scars? But those scars are obviously there. What I personally believe is that the more we talk about these events, the more we bring them out into the public domain, the more we are able to share the loss and the trauma, the more we can proceed towards healing and forgiving. But again, that is not something that really regularly happens in a country like India, where the repressed trauma often becomes weaponized into various forms of divisive hatred and not necessarily something constructive.
Very true. I think what you have said about positionality is also very important. That post-colonial scholars like us speak without positionality. We are not really in a position to understand what the people who are suffering the trauma of colonial problems have gone through. So that is absolutely true. Now, I would just open this up for the audiences. Is there anybody who has any questions? And are there any questions in the chat box? Very
Yeah,
strange.
there are four questions in the chat
Yeah.
box, so let me just answer them one by one.
Yes.
Uh, the idea of ideal state politics, how should one be an ideal nation to look on or fight with corruptions and misjudgment that one is facing in the nations like India? Well, Fano's answer would be to again go to the people, to energize the people, to enlighten the people, to awaken the people, which is again extremely time consuming, which is extremely difficult. And of course, Fano was writing at a time when there was no social media, where there were no reels on TikTok and things of that sort. So obviously there are challenges, but again, I don't think there is any other option than going to the people and sort of learning from them and addressing their concerns as much as possible, as extensively as possible. The other question is, didn't Fano see culture as both battleground and a tool for liberation? Of course, that is right. He did, because on the one hand, you have to fight the influences of colonial stereotypification, and on the other hand, you also have to fight the tendency of seeing everything that is in the past as being good, as being worth imitating. When we talk about Indian cultural past, we often get into this mode of celebrating ourselves and the various achievements that were made by Indians in the past. And of course, there are a lot of things that we have for which we should really be very proud. But then again, there are also things like Shwatidam. There are also things like caste-based violence. There are also things like ballo vivaho and bahu vivaho and so on. So one has to be critical when one is looking at the past. There are things that you can take and be proud of, and there are other things which you must necessarily discard. That is why the battle is constant, and it is only by accepting the vital and rejecting the decadent that one can really hope for cultural liberation as well. There is a question that the desire for an overriding national culture and the aspirations of a multicultural space. For example, Northeast India. Yeah, that is what I was saying. If you are trying to impose something from the top as a national culture or as a national language or as a national ritual and so on and so forth, then there are problems. That is never going to really be acceptable in a country like India, where there are so many pluralities of so many different versions. So that is obviously difficult if one looks at culture from a top-down perspective. Instead, if one learns from the people and gives space to the different kinds of local cultures, histories, and conventions, then it is possible to create a kind of a pluralistic space of harmony and coexistence rather than one of conflict and erasure.
Right. Are we done with the question in the chat
I
box then?
Yeah, I think we are done. There's just one issue about GDP and income of the individual. As I said, one can go on talk about GDPs as much as one wants, but Human Development Index obviously shows a different reality, and one has to take that into account as well instead of simply focusing on the GDP, because the GDP doesn't give you the true picture of the inequality that exists. And that is something that needs to be taken into consideration.
Any further audience? If anybody would like to ask something, you can unmute yourself and ask Abinda directly.
Abin, the first question came from Sushmita, who is from Nepal. Huh? She was
Okay,
here
ma'am.
on the screen a little while ago. Yeah.
Right.
So, but it came to me, so I copy pasted it to you there.
Sure.
Okay, so any more questions? Dr. Prasad, Anil Prasad, would you have something to say? Roshan, Khagendra? Oh, Dr. Prasad's mic is going to let us down again. While he's sorting out his mic, I must say, Abin, we appreciate the effort that you've put in. I think you made a very fine presentation with all the
Thank you.
main points. Yeah, all the main points that need to be told about Franz Fanon. And let's see if Dr. Prasad can speak up now. No. And Khagendra says, I've enjoyed listening. Thank you. No questions. Roshan, anything from you?
Yeah, me too. It was a very, very lucidly presented, lecture, and is what's the name? Somrita. In fact, she brought in positionality. Abin talked about political education, and I think we as scholars have much possibly to learn from these two aspects that he discussed very clearly. Of course, Abin has his, subject position here as he presents it, and he brought in some very, very relevant examples that have contemporary relevance, currency, and but this, this point of positionality, Abin, this needs to be emphasized a lot because the beauty of Fanon is that, he makes sense to every person anywhere in the world, whichever political system he or she may be from. And when it comes to, of course, the post-colonial studies that we undertake as students of literature, we cannot imagine doing this, without understanding basic Fanon, which you presented so lucidly. So thank you, Abin. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
No
sir.
question,
Thank
no
you.
question at all. Thank you.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because there are certain common issues all across the globe. And what Fanon has done is that he's systematically put them across in a manner that we can all follow, that we can understand. And of course, Abin has further simplified it for all of us. So let's see if we can hear Dr. Prasad now. Dr. Prasad, please speak up. No, still not there. Okay, so it is time for us to wind up. And I must tell you that we are going to be meeting again next week. And next week we are meeting not on Wednesday, but we'll be meeting on Tuesday because of certain restrictions regarding the date. And we'll be talking about not something academic like today. Today it was very academic and very informative. But the next Tuesday, the coming Tuesday, in fact, we will be talking about, this is going to be the 15th, we'll be talking about Sunita Williams. There'll be two people in the conversation, and they brought out a book on Sunita Williams some time ago, some years ago, and now they are going to be talking about her experiences, and perhaps they are going to write a sequel to their previous book. Just today, somebody has circulated something on WhatsApp, a long message which talks about the experiences of Sunita Williams when she was, up there in space, going round and round, wondering if she would come back. And she says, there was death staring in my face. I don't know how authentic it is, but it's making the rounds on WhatsApp, and it's very interesting indeed. So we'll be talking about that next time. Anyway, coming back to this session, I must say it has been a very interesting one, very informative. And Abin has, he's put in so much of work, which we all appreciate. Somrita has done an excellent job. But a formal vote of thanks, I think we leave it to one of our youngsters. Ishtiaq is there. Ishtiaq, would you like to give a formal vote of thanks? Ishtiaq is the
Sure,
one
ma'am.
who makes all those beautiful creatives for us. Yes, Ishtiaq?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, ma'am, for giving me this opportunity. You have done most of the job, but I would just like to, emphasize on how important it is for us young scholars and all the scholars around the world, to not take academia in a very soft stance, And today, Dr. Abin, he did that, he asked all the hard-hitting questions, and I really thank him for opening up the session to a largely political, stance that he takes. And also, Somrita ma'am, who asked very important questions. So I'm very thankful to Dr. Abin Chakraborty and Ms. Somrita for this great session. I'm also thankful to all the Mellow office bearers here, Professor Roshan Lal Sharma, hello, Professor Anil Prasad, Dr. Khagendra, whom we cannot thank enough for all the hospitality that he showed us in Nepal. We could keep on thanking him forever for this. And finally, Professor Manju Jetka. And we hope to see you guys again in 4 or 5 days, the creative for which will be shared as soon as possible. So thank you everyone for listening, and thank you for joining in this session. With ma'am's permission, I think we could end the session now.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you,
Thank
Ishtiaq.
thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you,
And let
Ishtiaq,
me tell you
Abin,
that the
Somrita.
circular is already out for the next conference, so look out for it and start preparing. Until
Sure.
Thank you.
next week, until next Tuesday, bye-bye. We'll meet again.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.